Okay, welcome everyone, and thanks for coming along to our webinar today. We've got two parts to the webinar. First, looking at our MTFP model update and looking really at the short term and the medium term funding forecast that we're looking at to go behind that, to go into the model and to update it. Then Dan's going to take us through his first analysis of the 25-26 published accounts, most of which are now available. So we're starting to get to the point where that's telling us, you know, the real bottom line truth about where we are in financial terms as a sector. So starting off with looking at the MTFP model and the short and medium term forecasts. Of course, we know there's been a massive change in funding distribution in the current financial year following Fair Funding 2.0. That's the change we've really been waiting for over quite a number of years now. So it's, you know, the thing that we've been looking forward to for a long time has now happened. In theory, that means we are entering a period of relative certainty where changes should be relatively limited. Now, whether that's the case or not, we don't know. There clearly will be some things that are much more locked down now than we've been used to in the past. So the next 3 years should be more certain than we've had for a while. But there are other changes that are happening, political changes, change of Prime Minister, and you never know what that brings with it. And then looking further ahead over the longer term, we're now looking out as far as 2035-36. So we're looking nearly a decade into the future. Clearly, there are more variables there. Things can change to a much greater degree. So just looking at what that might bring over that longer term period. As I said, the changes that we need to make to the model in 26-27 through to 28-29 are relatively limited. Much of the settlement is locked down now. There are still some things that we do need to think about. I think if any changes are going to be made, there'll be increases to our existing settlement, certainly for SEND, possibly for social care. And we also need to think about what the impact might be of the budget later this year, probably in November, and then the spending review next year. So there are still some things that can change even within the next 3-year window. Then longer term forecasts, we've built in what we think might happen for future funding resets, both in 29-30 and 32-33. We'll come to those in more detail later. So looking at things like the business rate reset, what does council tax equalisation do over the longer period? What do the need shares look like when we adjust them for things like population? And then at the end, there's a short update about what we're now expecting our new Prime Minister to be, Andy Burnham. We don't know precisely what he will do when he does become Prime Minister later this month. We can go on things like the speech he gave at the end of June following his by-election win. But other than that, there's still a lot of gaps in our understanding of what that might mean specifically for local government. So in terms of the short-term funding forecasts, this is the kind of the list of things we'll go through. Start off with the funding context. So look at the change in core spending power since 2010-11. We've updated that time series so you can see where the next 3 years fits in with that longer time series. We'll think about the potential changes in assumptions for the next 3 years. As I said, relatively limited. The one change we do know that will happen is that there will be a business rate baseline adjustment. So that was following the 26 revaluation adjustment. As we know, there's an adjustment to that adjustment, which will come through. We've got some information now about how that will actually work. We're assuming the Band D council tax thresholds remain the same, although clearly there is some scope to change that if ministers want to. Talk a little about the adjustment support grant, the 1-year grant that came in alongside the final settlement, and whether that might be continued. And then look at the spending review for 27 and the potential adjustments that I don't think there will be any particularly, but there is the scope for some potential adjustments for 28-29. SEND funding, we'll touch on that a little bit, and Dan's got some numbers later on about what that looks like based on the financial accounts. But I think really there's a relatively limited range in our funding scenarios, and the range in outcomes is much less than we had in the run-up to the Fair Funding Review 2.0. So we are, even though there may be changes here and there around the settlement, we're looking at much less change than we've been used to over the last 4, 5, 6, even 10 years really. And I think for authorities, in terms of when you actually do look at the MTFP model and think about what the outcomes might be for you, or what the planning basis might be for your budgets, I think a lot of the variation will come from your local taxation assumptions. So things like, you know, what do members want to do around Band D? What's your council tax growth looking like? What's your business rates growth looking like, including things like appeals and bad debt? So it's the weight of where your forecasts are now will be much more about your local forecast than about thinking too much about what's happening in the wider settlement, although that still remains important. So starting to now look at the funding context, and you'll recall that we produced both cash terms and real terms change in core spending power from 2010 to 2025-26. We published background information on that and our sources and methodology for doing that. So we used adjusted changes in core spending power published in the settlements going back to 2010-11. So we could get that sort of like for like adjusted change from 10-11 through to 25-26. Now the next 3 years are slightly tricky because obviously there were lots of rolled in amounts, there were lots of adjusted amounts that weren't then backdated through the whole time series. So what we've done then is for the next 3 years, 26, 27 onwards, we've simply added on the adjusted increases in core spending power in each of those 3 years. So it's not precisely comparable, but I think it gives a good amount of reasonable comparability over that whole period. Just to take us through the whole story over the last 15 years, and then taking us through the full 20-year period.
I realised it's your birthday. I didn't say it.
Could you mute yourself, please? Thanks. So if we look back at the period from 2010 through to 2016, huge cash terms cuts in local government funding. Overall, a cut of 20.5% by 2016-17 and 28% in real terms. So they're unprecedented cuts both in funding and also council tax freeze as well. So that was a huge amount of funding that the sector had to contend with. Then I think we need to remember that the period from 2017 was to some degree from 2017 through to 2020 onwards, the conditions improved, but it was really from 2020 through to 25-26 that we really saw a huge increase in funding for local government. Big cash terms increases and a big real terms uptick in funding as well for the sector. So by the end of the period, core spending power was 28% higher in cash terms than 2010-11, but it was still lagging in real terms by about 14.7%. So even with that big, massive increase in funding that we had over that period, I know it might not felt like it because you were still contending with big increases in budget pressures, but there was a big real terms increase in core spending power, but the sector was still around 15% below where it had been in real terms in 2010-11. And then it's only when we get to the end of this next 3-year period that the real terms position gets back to where it was in 2010-11. So you can see there the real terms position is only 3.4% below where it was in real terms. So we're almost there. But of course, during that period at the same time, you've not just been contending with increases in unit costs and prices, you've also been increasing with a big increase in demand as well. So even though in real terms we may just about have caught up with where we were by the end of 28-29, there's still that enormous pressure that's come through that you're dealing with on the same amount of resources. So that's the background. The multi-year settlement itself, and I think it will almost certainly remain unchanged for the next 3 years. So the fair funding allocations that you've had, the allocations within the consolidated grants, I cannot see those changing over the next 3 years. I'd expect the next 3 years to operate in a very similar way to the most recent multi-year settlement we had, which was 16-17 through to 19-20. So the core funding settlement that you had was fixed for 4 years. There were no changes to those core amounts. The changes that did happen were additions to this core settlement. And I would expect that if there are going to be changes over the next 3 years, there will be additions to the core settlement. I don't think they're going to go back and change what you've had and reduce it. So I think you can use the multi-year settlement with a lot of confidence over the next 3 years. I think the issue as we start to get towards the end of that period is that the government's got some really quite significant fiscal squeeze to deal with that they'll need to handle in the spending review 2027. My guess is that doesn't affect 28-29, and certainly not. I really do not think it will affect the fair funding allocations that you've got for that third year. But it does start to change the environment at that point, and the Chancellor, whoever that is, will be looking for things that they will need to cut back on. So that spending review, the last one was in 2025. You can see our briefing note on that from the 11th of June. It technically covered 2 financial years, 26, 27 and 27, 28, and then provided illustrative allocations for 28, 29. So they will be going back next year in that spending review and reviewing what the spending plans are for 28, 29. So it'll firm up or amend those 28, 29 allocations, and then we assume it then provides allocations both firm and then indicative for the next 2 years as well. And this will be the final spending review before the end of the Parliament. As we'll see on the following slide, really quite severe fiscal challenges for the incoming Prime Minister and Chancellor, and we don't yet know how they'll resolve them. I guess the first formal indications of how they might do that will be in the budget. That should be budget 2026, which I assume would be in November 2026. You know, the incoming government will need a bit more time to work out what it's going to do in that budget. So my guess would be it'll be towards the end of November, or in November anyway. And then we have this fiscal squeeze towards the end of the Parliament. There's a good graphic there from the IFS looking at what the planned real terms growth is in departmental spending, which is the key one for us, over the next 4 years. And what the IFS said is that the spending plans that the Chancellor agreed, they're front loaded. So there's big amounts of growth in 26, 27, and then a much bigger squeeze towards the end of the period. So real terms growth in 26, 27 of 1.8%, falling to only 1% over the following 3 years. So when you then strip out the planned spending increases for the NHS, particularly for defence, and then for other key priorities, things like SEND, there's not a lot left for the other non-priority departmental spending areas, and most of local government tends to fall into that bracket. There's a question about whether adult social care would be a protected service or not. It will tend to get a better settlement than much of the rest of the public sector, but generally we need to assume that local government will be one of the lower priorities for the government. But the IFS also says that even though the current planned spending figures look like there's a squeeze towards the end of the Parliament, on most occasions a Chancellor will come back and find top-ups further down the line. So I think we should assume that it won't be quite as bad as this looks like in the current numbers. But nevertheless, there will be, the finances are tight. It will make it less easy for a new Prime Minister to find more funding for things like social care, and more downward pressure, I think, on what the spending review looks like and the settlement looks like from 29-30 onwards. So just running through what this might mean in terms of assumptions for funding over for total resources over the next 3-5 years. We're assuming that Band D remains unchanged, that there's no change in the threshold. These have become quite established now: 2.99% core, 2% precept, and then £5 maximums for shire districts and fire authorities. There's some potential, I think, for an increase in the shire districts and fire authority maximums from £5 to £10, but I can't see the other threshold changing. Then looking at SFA and FFA, planned increase in the current financial year, 2.9%, falling to about 1.4% over the next 2 years. And our view is that, I think our core forecast is that the FFA increases will continue at around 1.4% over the longer term, which technically is a real terms cut if we assume inflation's around 2%. And there's probably a potential range for FFA increases over the longer term of between 0 and 2.5%. But this is looking at 29-30 onwards. Public health grant, planned increase of 2% in 27, 28 and 29, and 1.3% for the other elements within that consolidated grant. We'd expect public health grant to continue to increase by around 2.2% up to 3.5% over the medium term, and our core forecast is for a 2% increase after the current multi-year settlement period. The other homeless and rough sleeping and domestic abuse grant, again, planned increases of around 2% over the next few years, and our potential range for forecasts over the longer term is 1.5% to 2.5%. For the others, we're assuming cash flat over the longer term after the current multi-year settlement period is over. So in some ways, I think our view of what the spending review might do for the medium term or the longer term position is that not an awful lot of change from the average increases or average changes that we're looking at over the 3-year multi-year settlement, and certainly using 27, 28 and 28, 29 as a good guideline for what the longer term trends might look like. I mentioned the adjustment support grant. In some ways, it's not a huge grant in terms of cash, but it is important for quite a few authorities. You recall that this grant was introduced for 1 year, for 26-27, to compensate authorities who were losing out from the changes that were made in the final settlement. The idea was to make sure that no authority had less in the final settlement than they did in the provisional settlement. There was the error, as you recall, about how they were rolling in business rate growth and how they'd adjusted for the pooling effect of that rolling. And you can see there that, notwithstanding the City of London, who received a huge amount, most of the authorities who received that money were high business rate growth shire districts, places like North West Leicestershire, Harborough, for instance, South Derbyshire, who received huge amounts of funding from this relative to what their overall total resources are. But also some upper tier authorities as well, places like Thurrock, Warrington, York, Metz, like Leeds as well, receiving amounts that were relatively substantial, although less so in the context of their overall budgets. So the grant payment in 26-27 is 115 million, made to 135 authorities. If it was to continue, the amounts that it would cost would be relatively small, as the base on which it's calculated would start to unwind. So it would reduce to about 84 million in 28-29 and 75 million in 29-30. So they're not huge amounts of money, but I do think it's unlikely to continue for a few reasons. One is that I think the argument will be that councils have had sufficient time to adjust for the reductions in funding that were put through in the final settlement. I think many of those authorities who would continue to receive adjustment support grant would already have a big cliff edge in 28-29, and continuing ASG will just make this even worse. And I mean, we can argue about this, but I think the original proposals in the provisional settlement were incorrect. How much more correct the final approach was, you could argue about, but I do think that the concept of allocating all the pooling gains to the tariff authorities was not the correct approach. It wasn't a balanced approach to take. So I do not think this is likely to be continued over 27, 28 and 28, 29, but if it was continued, the amounts would be relatively small, but the impact on some of the shire district councils would be really quite significant. We have that as an option in the model if you want to see what effect that does have on your funding. So one of the key things that we did tend to look at in the run up to 26-27 was whether there would be additional funding for adult social care. And one of the reasons for this was that the amounts that were coming through for social care in specific grants were really, really quite significant. By the end of 25-26, local government was receiving almost £10 billion in social care funding. So that amount of funding had really ramped up year on year since about 2016, 2017 onwards. Most of that now has been rolled into fair funding allocations. The only exception is the ongoing local authority better care grant, which is kept out of the RSG pot for just 1 year, for 26-27. And our previous assumptions tended to be that there will be an increase of £500 million per year in adult social care funding. My view now is that's probably much less unlikely. I think government's probably taking the view that the overall settlement package is the overall settlement package, and they're probably getting a bit less pressure on them from authorities to put more money into social care. So I think our default would be that there will be no more additional funding for adult social care over the next 3 years, but I think there must be some possibility of that, and you may want to explore what that looks like in the model. There are options for doing that. I think the big growth in funding for the sector over the next 3 years is going to come through SEND and the high needs deficit grant, which will be really chunky amounts of funding. And let's just look on that now. I mean, our forecasts were that the payment, well, the deficit will be about 5.5 billion as at the end of 25-26, and then it could rise by about 2.5 to 3 billion pounds per year. The LPR, which is a bit lower than our forecast, suggesting the deficit or the cost to the government will be 6.3 billion by 28-29. That looks way too low now, and I think even our figures, our 5.5 billion deficit looks too low now, and we'll see from Dan's numbers later that it looks like it's running at maybe at least £1 billion higher than that. So the cost will be significant for the government for the period up to 31st of March 2026. I mean, we've had quite a few conversations with councils about whether this grant will continue. I mean, our strong view is that it will continue, and it will probably continue at 90% of the deficit as well, but that is not confirmed. And clearly that would have a big impact on local authorities if the SEND system is unreformed and the deficit continues to rise at the same kind of scale. There will need to be funding in place to help authorities. Otherwise, authorities will just be back to where they would have been within a couple of years anyway. So I think that funding has to continue. We've kept it out of the model for now, simply because it's not formula driven grant payment. It's based on your actual deficits, which are difficult for us to forecast. So we've kept it out for now, but we will continue to model it outside the MTFP model. The baseline reset is something that we know will happen in the next settlement. So we'll see the next numbers or an adjustment to the baselines in the 27-28 settlement, but the adjustment will be applied to your business rate baselines for 26-27, and thereby it will affect your top-ups and tariffs for 26-27 as well. So the revised adjustments will be published in the 27-28 provisional local government finance settlement and applied to the 26-27 financial year. So the way that government's proposing to do this is that it will update the business rate baselines using the final rateable values rather than using the draft ones that were available at the time of the last settlement. So they use the pardon me, the final rateable values that are published by the VOA to effectively restate your business rate baseline. So the gross rates figures can be calculated from those rateable values that are published by the VOA, and that'll be used then to restate the basis for your 27-28 and 28-29 business rate baselines as well. So that kind of flows through the whole calculations over the multi-year period. They'll then apply the same assumptions for bad debts, 0.6%, and appeals, 3.75%, to those revised gross race amounts. So the same methodology will be applied, but the numbers will change because your gross rates amounts will change as well. And then billing authorities are being asked to provide updated data on designated areas and on renewable energy as well. So you will receive a consultation paper from MHCLG in the next couple of weeks with an attachment for you to fill in if you do have DAs or renewable energy. They want to collect some more information on that. Some of it I think will be discretionary as well, but MHCLG are really urging you to complete that discretionary data request if you possibly can, and it'd be great if you could. We've asked for the final rateable value data set to be released alongside that consultation so that we can update our MTFP model and we can get those BRB adjustments calculated as soon as possible so that you can see what they look like and what the impact on you will be. That will exclude the DA and renewable energy elements, but you can update that when you know what they are for yourselves. So the model currently works on the basis of what you published in the NNDR1 for 26-27. Most authorities were close to the baseline in 26-27, as you would expect, but there were some variances and some were quite significant in places. I think the reason for any variances is because you are using assumptions for bad debts and particularly for appeals that are different from those that we used to create your baseline. So I think from looking at the numbers, I think that's the reason why you may be seeing some differences between the retained rates in the model and the actual baselines that we've got from the settlement. Any changes in the baseline that's the result of using the final rateable values, in theory, the effect of that will be just to make sure that whatever the figures that you had are at baseline. So it's comparing what the draft and final rateable values are and adjusting the baseline on that basis. And the idea would be that the actual gross rates you're collecting as at the 1st of April are the same as what's assumed in the business rate baseline. And that should be the case. Clearly, you may have had growth or contraction during the financial year of 26-27. You may also have made different assumptions around bad debts and appeals. So you won't absolutely be at baseline at the 1st of April, but there may, the theory should be that the business rate baseline that you get once the adjustments put through is the same or very similar to the amount of business rates that you're collecting and retaining. So the medium term, long term funding forecasts, looking at the funding distribution as well, and looking at other things like recovery grant, looking at the long term effects of the business rate baseline, the cliff edge that we already know is happening in 28-29, and then the transitional support, which we've started to model. We don't know how that will work, but clearly it will be a very important part of the next multi-year settlement that we get. So looking further ahead, but even then, I think the range of funding scenarios is still relatively limited, and there's a much narrower range of potential outcomes than we saw in the run up to the Fair Funding Review 2.0. So thinking about funding distribution over that longer term period, I mean, we're assuming that the next funding updates will be in 2029-30, so the year after the current multi-year settlement, and that, you know, our assumption then is that they operate on a 3-yearly basis. So the next one after that would be 2032-33. So our assumption would be that there'll be a regular funding updates incorporating both business rate baseline reset of some kind and then some form of fair funding review. But clearly, the more frequently you make these updates, the less change there is and the easier it is for us to forecast. I think 26-27 was such a singular year. It was extremely difficult to forecast with a huge range of potential outcomes. Hopefully, in the future, they'll be much more predictable, much more frequent, and resulting in much less redistribution. The approach we've taken in 29-30 and in 32-33 is to refresh the needs assessments using population projections. So we've used the 2022 based population projections from the ONS. So we just rebased the needs assessments on a per head basis with the population projections. And then we updated the council tax deductions based on the forecast council tax income. So we've essentially used the same distribution of needs, but just updated population and then updated the council tax equalisation assumptions within that. Our view is that the scope for making major changes to the relative needs formulas is relatively limited, but we've explored what the potential might be in a later slide. We've not updated other things like the control totals or the RNF weightings either, so it's a relatively simple way of updating the distribution of FFA. And actually, the impact of updating population and council tax is not particularly clear cut. I thought it might have been a bit clearer, but it isn't. I suppose there's a lot of noise going on there in terms of what the population changes are and what the council tax is relative to that as well. Inner London seems to gain a little bit, and I guess that's possibly from population growth. Shire districts also gain as well. And I think that's because districts tend to have had a lower share of the council tax equalisation deduction. County councils have tended to lose share. Council tax equalisation seems to make that happen. For other grants, I think the only likely option is possibly to introduce the new formula for public health grant. This was the formula that was created way back in 2016. I think it's still a viable formula. I'm not sure why it wasn't applied in 26-27, but I think that's the only real option I can see outside FFA for making changes in grant distribution. The recovery grant and what happens to it is going to be a key issue as well. We know that it was confirmed for 3 years up to 28-29, and then added on to that was the recovery grant guarantee and the recovery grant uplift. Our default assumption is that the grant will end at that point and roll into FFA in 29-30, and then be distributed using the FFA formulas that are in operation at that time. The alternative is that it continues again for another year or 3 years. I think that is unlikely, just because it was a short-term grant, and I think for 29-30 there's more time to think about how ministers want to replace it. But the thing about recovery grant was that it was really effective at directing funding towards authorities with high levels of deprivation, and it did a better job of doing that than the formulas that ministers used as part of Fair Funding 2.0. So I think ministers will need to think of something that does a better job for the recipients of recovery grant than they had in Fair Funding 2.0. But in the model, you can look at the impact of continuing it or rolling it in. In terms of the future strategy for councils and also for representative groups, looking at changes in how they might want to position themselves in the approach to the 2029 funding review. As I said, I think there are limited options for change now. A lot of the big formulas now I think are pretty well nailed down, and I think it'll be a while before there's an attempt to really change them significantly. So the scope for change I think is quite limited. Looking at children's and adults, I think they are pretty much settled. I think the one question that will need to be re-examined will be the use of pre or post housing IMD. That was something that the ministers in sort of late summer into the autumn decided to use post housing IMD, which favoured London relative to lots of metropolitan authorities. That's one I think needs to be argued out a bit more. I think there's some room for further review of foundation formula. I think that's probably more about the visitor data that's used, but also I think there's some's got to look at the waiting for deprivation as well. But again, I think the scope for change is fairly limited. And I think for the other RNFs, they're actually relatively small. So the impact, again, will be small if there are any changes to those. There's possibly some more scope for change because they would create a little bit more on the hoof, homeschool transport and temporary accommodation in particular. I think high-risk maintenance is probably a bit more settled. I think the fire RNF is the one main RNF that hasn't yet been reviewed. And I think many fire authorities will be quite supportive of having a full formula review. I understand. I think the Fire Chiefs Council has started to look at resurrecting the research that would support a review of the fire RNF. So that's the one major RNF that might be reviewed if there is a funding review in 29-30. I think it's also very difficult to substantially shift the assumption on full count stats equalisation as well. I think we've pretty much got to that point where the whole of count stats income will be equalised. Clearly, a future government could make a different decision. It's fairly discretionary, the approach that you take, but I think for our purposes for forecasting, I think it's pretty much nailed on that we're looking at full count stats equalisation, certainly in 29-30. And again, I think we need to be factoring in what the effect of a baseline reset looks like for business rates in 29-30 and 32-33. The policy for successive governments from 13-14 onwards was that when they did the full fair funding review, there'll be a full 100% baseline reset as well, which is what happened. And then the expectation has been that following that, there'll be regular partial resets. MHCLG is going to undertake a consultation on this on future resets later in the year. Our assumption in the modelling now is that there will be following the full reset in 26-27, there'll be a 50% reset in 29-30 and in 32-33. But you can select whether you want to look at the impact of a full or partial reset at those points. And then we're assuming that any surplus from the reset rolls into FFA as well. I think that principle now has been confirmed as part of FFR 2.0. But the amounts will be smaller in future years if resets are more frequent and if they are partial. So those with growth will get to keep more of the growth, and there'll be some resources rolling into FFA, but they'll be less than they were in the last year. So you see there 25-26 right at the bottom line, the national business rate surplus in 25-26 was around 1.5 billion. That's the 50% scheme. On top of that, you've got the pooling and the pilot gains as well. But that's broadly the amount that was rolled into FFA in 26-27. You'll see on the chart there that in our modelling, where we've assumed that there will be growth based on previous trends, that the above baseline surplus is generated again, but it's just much lower than we've had in the recent past, just because there will be less time for that surplus to build up, maybe only 3 years rather than the 12 years that it took to get to 1.5 billion in 25-26. So in 28-29, we're forecasting that the surplus is only 250 million. In 31-32, it's only grown to 382 million, but by the end of 35-36, it's up to 653 million. So roughly the same sort of growth rates are in our modelling, but there's just less time for those surpluses to build up if we've got partial resets and more frequent resets. For many of you, transitional support over the period from 29-30 is really important because many of you will be way above the formula-driven funding allocations. There's a lot of transitional support built into the system as well. The phasing of FFA changes will at least have been fully applied by 28-29, 1/3 in 26-27, the 2/3 in 27-28. So that will the phasing at least has fully worked its way through. But a lot of the funding floor payments will still be in the system, as much as 448 million in 29-30. So there's a lot of funding floor payments still in the system at the end of the multi-year period. I think we can also classify the recovery grant guarantee and uplift as transitional payments as well. Those amounts are less considerable for these authorities than the funding floor payments, but they're still important nevertheless. And then adjustment support grant, that only applies to 1 year, to 26-27. But putting all these figures together, all these amounts together of transitional support, it results in a very significant cliff edge in 28-29. So I really do think that some form of transitional support is going to be necessary, even if there are no future changes in funding distribution. So this is the scale of the cliff edge in 28-29. Biggest in lots of shire district councils, but pretty significant for quite a few inland boroughs as well. K&C, Camden, Islington, and then getting on to some Mets as well, places like South Tyneside, Knowsley, Sunderland and St Helens, for instance. So quite a big cliff edge. Our approach has been to model a fairly simple transitional support floor, looks at an authority's total resources, so FFA plus grants, council tax and the funding floor in 29-30, and includes the impact of resetting business rate baselines as well. Our default setting is a -5% floor in each of the funding years from 29-30 onwards, so it applies in every year rather than just year one. I think we've got a range of -10 to +2, but I think if the transitional support is going to get scaled back or phased out within a reasonable time frame, then the transitional floor does need to be set at less than 0. And I think -5 is probably the point at which you manage to get rid of that cliff edge and phase in all the changes over a reasonable time period. But ministers are reluctant to put through big cuts in funding, and that may well be the same again. And if that's the case, then what you're looking at from 29-30 is possibly a more generous floor. So there are different settings you can put into the model to look at what that looks like. Looking over, as you put all those forecasts together and those assumptions together, what we see over the that longer term period from 29-30 onwards is a relatively narrow band of assumptions around what the overall funding outcomes look like. And in terms of annual changes, they range from about 3.3 up to about 5% per year. So a relatively narrow band. A lot of that's driven by council tax growth, but it means that we're probably looking at small real terms growth in total resources in each year over the longer term period. Very briefly, what does the new Prime Minister bring? We know some things about what Andy Burnham would like to do: more devolution, more powers to local authorities, potentially new taxes as well. But there's still some big choices that we don't know about, particularly around public spending, the form of devolution, and how he might follow it with things like regional funding distribution. The best we've got at the moment in terms of what he's actually said is the speech he gave on the 29th of June. So we know there'll be a lot more devolution of funding streams and powers. We've seen some of the big statements he's made there about the biggest rebalancing of power our country has seen. He said he wants sound public finances and the discipline of fiscal rules, but there's still some scope there about things like additional funding, more borrowing, changes in taxation. But I think the scope there probably is relatively limited. Some big statements as well about the redistribution between regions. He's talked about this thing called the German Basic Law, but I think there is already quite significant redistribution between regions. So I'm not quite sure how much further he can go there. The biggest council house building programme, I think, since the war, probably won't be quite that big, but certainly he's looking at a significant increase in council house building. Clearly that will affect the housing revenue accounts directly and possibly give councils greater powers to borrow within the HRA. Some reforms of business rates, particularly around shifting the balance between high street rateable values and out of town distribution. There's a report this will cost around 880 million, but that will be funded as it has been in the past, I'm sure, and potentially the widening of the 100% business rate pilots to encompass all mayoral combined authorities. Some tax raising powers, and you can see there's a link to the House of Commons library note about it, but I don't think that they're very significant, to be honest. And then some more substantial changes that may come through. They weren't mentioned in his speech. Things like cross-rail type investment in infrastructure. I think if he really goes for it, then it's things like reform of council tax and stamp duty, which will significantly change what council tax looks like. I think if that's going to be adopted, that's not likely to be until 29-30, and probably after a general election as well. Valuing properties is a huge task, but it would effectively be a new local property tax, and as such, it could work within the local government finance system, but it would fundamentally recast what that looks like. But I think there's also questions about how these powers and funding are allocated between mayors, MCAs, and local authorities. We don't know what that looks like yet. We've made a lot of changes to the MTFP model, and I will put out a full briefing note explaining exactly what we've done and how to make those changes in the model. A list of the assumptions that we've got and within the model, and again I'll put those in the briefing note. And then just briefly looking at the what that looks like in overall terms at class level out to 2035-36. You can see there that Inner London was the major loser from the Fair Funding 2.0, and although it starts to grow again over the medium to longer term, it doesn't really start to close the gap with other classes of authority. So that's the red line at the bottom. Then you can see the green dotted line, that's shire districts. You can see there again did particularly badly again in the Fair Funding 2.0, and again they do start to close that gap a little bit with other classes, but you can see the wiggly line. You can see the impact of the baseline reset on shire district councils in 32-33 and 29-30. So it's not a consistent catch up. Outer London continues to be the best performing class. The metropolitan authorities, they start to move closer to the national average. I think possibly because of the cliff edge running out, and also I think possibly below average population growth, so that they start to converge with the metropolitan authorities, start to converge with the county authorities, who in our modelling anyway start to increase by more than the average over time, which I think is because of population growth and growth in council tax income. So that's kind of the outcome from all the assumptions and forecasting that we've made in our MTFP model. And as I said, the model will be released tomorrow. I'll send out a briefing note as well, along with the recording of this webinar. So we're kind of at the point of going on with a new model, and you're welcome to have a look at that. And Dan, I'm going to hand over to you. Apologies, I'm a little bit late there. There seemed to be a lot to get through in the end.
Thanks, Adrian. So I'm just going to, with apologies to those of you who might have seen this, although you won't have seen the last few days where more have released their accounts, but I'm just going to go through the published accounts for 25-26. If you move on, Adrian, please. So in terms of how many have published, we've only got 30 left unpublished now, which is way ahead of previous years. So less than 1 in 10 are still yet to publish, and most of those I can see delay notices, and most appear like they might get published in the next few weeks. So I think come the end of this month, we'll literally have a handful that are left to publish. So what you're about to see is with the benefit of 285 authorities that have published. So pretty much is the other figures for 25-26, albeit pre-audit, so they might change a little bit, and they do tend to change a little bit after they've been audited. So local authority teams have done their bit, I would say. It'll be interesting to see if you all, those of you with disclaimer audits, have get undisclaimed audits this year, but that remains to be seen. So if we move on, Jim. So what this is it's a balance sheet, an aggregate balance sheet for the upper tier and for districts separately. So the upper tier there on the left and districts on the right. So it's all of those that have published their figures for this and last year. So it misses about 10% of authorities. If you just go on another one, Adrian, I think I picked out the things that I find quite interesting. So usable revenue reserves have increased for the first time at the upper tier. That's the first time in 3 years where in aggregate usable revenue reserves have increased, but there's a lot of EFS in that. If you took EFS out, you'd see probably a 1% reduction. So some authorities have had big boosts effectively to their reserves with the EFS. I think it's fair to say, though, that the decrease of the last 3 years is starting to bottom out, and we'll see this in a minute. But like the previous 3 years, DSG deficits for the upper tier have continued to increase 78%. Sorry, it's wrong in that red box there. It's 78%, up to 5.8 billion now. Adrian mentioned, I think 5.5 billion being the OBR estimate. Well, that 5.8 billion amidst the last 13 upper tier authorities, which I think collectively have nearly 400 million. So if you add that to the 5.8, you've got 6.2. If you add a 78% increase to the 400 million that's left, you're looking at 6.5, just north of 6.5 billion. So the DSG deficits are massive. And when you take reserves that aren't particularly plentiful with a massive increase in DSG deficits, you've got the size of current resources on the balance sheet for upper tier shrinking. And that, I think, is starting to play through to the borrowing position, because there's nothing on the balance sheets, or less on the balance sheets to support internal borrowing. So there's been a massive increase in external borrowing, particularly short-term borrowing, which for upper tier has increased by 20% in 25-26. So a lot more borrowing because there's not so much cash on the balance sheet. Districts, by contrast, the other way. As Adrian said, they did reasonably well out of the business rates localisation. It wasn't full reset, and still lots of districts have quite large reserves, which are the business rates gains that have just been sat in reserves. So they've got a contrary picture that their balance sheets are increasing, their current resources going up, and actually when they need to borrow, it's pretty much wholly been covered by internal borrowing, with only small increases in external borrowing. So if we move on one, we'll look at it in a bit more detail. So this graph here shows usable revenue reserves. Left-hand side is upper tier, right-hand side is districts. And it shows it's a proportional core spending power in 25-26. The lower two graphs show the movements since 24-25. So you can see there that, again, if in real terms, i.e. is expressed as a proportion of core spending power, the majority of upper tier authorities are still seeing reductions in usable revenue reserves, but quite a few are seeing increases. I should say that quite a few of those increases are due to exceptional financial support, given a cash boost to the authority that tends to sit in their balances at the year end. But on the whole, going down. District, although there are some notable reductions in reserves, the majority of districts are still going up. So it gives sort of picture there, a two-tier picture of the upper tier struggling still with reserves a little bit, but less so than in previous years, and lower tier not so much. If we move on one more, you'll see that in a sort of line graph. So you'll see for the past 3 years prior to this year, usable revenue reserves in upper tier have come down. They've come down reasonably steeply each year. This is in money terms, so in real terms it's much steeper still. But you'll see that's bottoming out now. So a slight increase at the upper tier, but thanks in no small part to EFS, a number of authorities, but the districts are seeing their reserves continue to rise. So again, a different picture. If we move on, let's look at DSG. So dedicated school grants deficits, I think more than anything else, have impacted upon the financial health of the upper tier. And there on the top left graph, you can see that's DSG balance as a proportion of CSP. So you can see, with the exception of 8 or 9 or 10 authorities, all of the upper tier authorities are in deficit. And when you look at the graph below it, you can see, with the exception of about 3 authorities, those in-year deficits across the board, which have led to further increases in DSG deficit. So, as I said a little bit earlier, 78% increase in accumulated deficits. So we're looking at about 6.5 billion. So the high need stability grant will make a massive difference, won't it? 5 billion plus going into sector will make a difference. But I suppose it is, if you look at the graph at the top right, it's the sharpness of the increase. All that the 5 billion will do is take it back towards the origin, but then it will, if there is no structural changes or few structural changes, those deficits will increase yet again, and as Adrian's intimated, there'll be continued pressure on central government to provide the funding to take those off local government's balance sheet. But the growth continues to be exponential, so it isn't sustainable without some huge changes to how DSG is, how SEND is administered. It's not sustainable. It's almost irrelevant. It's local government or central government. It's not sustainable given the trajectory that you see in that top right graph. So that's DSG deficits. For me, they overwhelm financial health in the upper tier more than anything else, more than everything else put together, I guess. If we move on, another one. So effectively, this sort of two-tier thing that we're going on. Districts are seeing revenue reserves go up, and that means there's increasing resources. That means they've not got the borrowing problems that upper tier have, but upper tier combination of fairly flaky levels of reserves that are with a bit of a downward pressure, at least in real terms, and increasing DSG deficits means that the cash on the balance sheet, the cash back resources on the balance sheet are shrinking more and more. And if we move on one, I'll try and explain what, this is current resources. So by current resources, I've taken all of the cash-backed resources on the balance sheet that I can find, so your usable revenue reserves, your usable capital reserves, and then a couple of the adjustment accounts. The DSG, because DSG adjustment account represents cash that's already been spent, but I've also put the collection fund adjustment account now. And I didn't remark on this earlier, but it's interesting to see that upper tier collection fund adjustment surpluses are reducing quite significantly, which points to potential in not being able to collect the full council tax and business rates that the market collected in previous years. So when you take all that together, the resources available to those authorities, you can see the bottom left graph there, they're pretty much reducing across the board. And those that have are much higher, probably more often than not, due to exceptional financial support, which loads the capital financing requirement. So real squeeze of resources on the balance sheet for upper tier, but the opposite in most districts. If we move on one, Adrian, try and explain how this I think there's a relationship between the current resources, i.e. the cash-back resources on the balance sheet, and the ability to use those resources for internal borrowing. And you can see there that those resources are starting to come down, continuing to come down, largely because of DSG deficits, and internal borrowing that tends to go up has flatlined now. And in a lot of authorities, it's reducing. In fact, half the upper tier authorities' internal borrowing is reducing, and that's been pushed into external borrowing. So the bottom graph there shows the composition of CFR between long-term, short-term, and internal borrowing. And internal borrowing is flattening out, but you can see that what's quite a thin blue line, but very, very much widening line. There's a massive increase in short-term borrowing across the upper tier. I think I said earlier, 20% up on last year. And I guess what that does is it leaves a lot of authorities on short-term borrowing at 4 or 5%, and the susceptibility to the volatility to world events and their knock-on effect for home interest rates. So I think it's calmed down now, but a couple of months ago, just after the Iran conflict started, I was told that the next couple of interest rate movements would be upwards. That might not be the case now, but certainly not showing much signs of coming down. And lots of authorities stuck with very significant amounts of short-term borrowing that actually could start going up in terms of interest rates if the volatility continues. So a more vulnerable position for the upper tier. And if we go on to the next slide, Adrian, should be able to see by contrast that there's quite a bit of short-term borrowing increase for districts as well. But you can see long-term borrowing is much more stable, because as resources have gone up, the top graph shows that as resources go up, then so does internal borrowing. So districts are much more able to use those additional resources on their balance sheet to avoid having to externalise borrowing for increased capital financing requirement. So you see a very different picture, big increase in internal borrowing, much less so external borrowing. If we move on one, I think it shows capital financing requirement. And what I mean to show the slide is actually, if there's a debt problem, it's not the level of debt, because actually in real terms, debt tends to be coming down. So the capital finance requirement as a proportion of cost spending power across most of the upper tier, the exception being a lot of inner and outer London boroughs that are doing lots of regeneration work, but they're the exception. The level of debt as a proportion of CSP tends to be coming down. It's not the level of debt per se, which if you were to read some of the reports, that's the impression you might be given, or the person in the street's given. It's the composition of the debt for me between internal and external borrowing. And if we move on one, I'll try and explain what I mean by that. So I think for the upper tier, as resources reduce, they can no longer sustain the levels of internal borrowing once did. That means they're pushed towards external borrowing, and that creates an increase in borrowing costs. It creates a decrease in interest receivable from money market, from the cash that's sat in the balance sheet, and that's like a pressure that feeds back into pressure on reserves, because all other things being equal, if there's a pressure and it can't be met, then effectively it's reserves that meets that pressure. And there you can see at the upper tier, pretty much all of the increase in CFR, which isn't great, has fallen on external borrowing. A 20% increase in short-term borrowing, even long-term borrowing has gone up, but internal borrowing has pretty much stayed as it was, and for lots of authorities has come down. When you look at what's been paid in terms of interest payable is going up, and the interest receivable, which is more significant, is coming down. That's actually masked a little bit by a number of authorities who've shown massive increases in interest receivable because they've done some sort of interest rate swaps. So if you took them out, the interest receivable across the board's actually down by about 10%. So that's upper tier. The net interest pressure is 10% just on last year, but the need to borrow is only going up modestly. Contrast that with the lower tier, where interest payable is not really going up and interest receivables coming down, but they haven't got the same sort of issues as the upper tier has. So once the government injects 5 billion or plus of high needs stability grant, then I expect this picture to change a little bit. There'll be a lot of cash there, and there'll be a lot more cash put on money in the short term, and there'll be a boost to internal borrowing up tier, one would hope, and we'll see this reversed. But I keep hearing from people that high need stability grants come in, but nobody knows when, by what it will look like. So the sooner the better, I would say. I think so. That takes me just to a quick conclusion. Adrian, I won't dwell on this. So hopefully you've seen pretty much the full picture, because over 90% of authorities have published. Still signs of financial stress for the upper tier, much less so for districts. DSG deficits are the cause of that stress more than anything else. I think once the high needs stability grant comes in, it provides significant release, and then exceptional financial support, which is quite big now. I've got to try and be able to pick that out from the figures. I think that'll start becoming exceptional again, because at the moment it feels like the whole upper tier sector is close to needing it, but the high needs stability grant, I think, will provide that relief for the majority of those, and then we'll get back to those with individual issues, pressures and problems that will still be inside the EFS system, but I don't think it will be as many as in previous years if 5 billion gets injected. And hopefully internal borrowing will become more sustainable, and hopefully short-term borrowing might reduce. In fact, as soon as 5 billion hits the upper tier, I expect a big reduction in short-term borrowing as cash levels increase significantly. So that's it. First conclusions. Very happy to answer any questions in the next session. Thank you. Thanks, Adrian.
That's brilliant, Dan. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, it's good to get that first cut of what's going on. We have to wait for the RO forms coming out later in the summer. We got it straight away. I think that's brilliant, Dan. I think that those numbers around the DSG deficit and the high needs deficit, I think to get those straight away is fascinating. Just one question: the numbers that you had there, the 5.8 billion, is that the whole DSG deficit or just the high needs element? Is that?
It's the whole DSG deficit, but I think most of that is high needs. The issue, I have to get it from the accounts, and I can only take from the accounts what's there, and some authorities split it up so you can see what's what, but not all do. So it's the whole deficit. But I think I've been told before that sometimes the high needs deficit is greater than the the whole deficit, if you see what I mean, because the other elements are possibly in surplus still. So that's interesting, but I can't quite see those figures across the board. So yeah, it could be that high needs is actually bigger than the 5.8, and the 5.8 is the 136 authorities that I think it is 137 that published. There's still 14 to go onto that 5.8.
Yeah, I think it's not something I've been that close to, but from what I understand is that the high needs deficit grant is payable on the whole deficit rather than just the high needs element. So that the figures you're reporting now will be the guideline for what the grant payment's going to be nationally. It's going to be higher than the government thought it was going to be. They were planning on a deficit of 5.5 billion and a payment of 5, and that's going to be at least $1 billion higher, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I mean, those of you who are here, the upper tier, I don't know if any of you've received any more specific details of the grants and when it's coming. But last time I did something like this, I was told that we still don't know when it's coming, that and that it's desperately needed, for the Treasury management teams as much as anything, to be able to move away from short-term borrowing. But I don't know if anyone's got any intel as to when it might actually hit the upper tier authorities.
Now keep our eyes on it, Dan. Yeah. A couple of questions. Apologies, I should have been a bit clear about exactly what I was doing with the model and what was going to come out. Lindsay's asked me. We will be issuing an updated version of the model. It'll be version 6.1. It's pretty much ready to go. So I will put that on the website tomorrow afternoon, and I'll send an email out to everybody when the model's there. I'll probably send it out at the same time that I send out the link to the recording of today. There's also a briefing note, a full briefing note that's pretty much ready to go as well, that explains what's in the model and what our thinking is and everything behind it. That will come out tomorrow as well. So there's hopefully a full package of things that will kind of underpin what we're doing with the new version of the model, and you can see what's going on there. We'll keep the model. We may need to update it as you come back and with questions to me, but that'll be. I'll send a full package of stuff out tomorrow to let you know exactly what's available. Jonathan Davis, Stockport. Yeah, October, Dan.
Yeah, so that's still a lot of short-term borrowing in the meantime, isn't it? So hopefully interest rates won't go up. That sounds quite reliable from what Jonathan
I guess they've got to wait for the RO forms. I'm sure they'll be looking at the final accounts as well. When they've got people, I'm sure they've got people there who can start to look through the accounts. Maybe you should send them your data, Dan.
I know I don't look at the accounts at all. I mean, some of the things that they come out with, particularly on reserves, I think they just rely on their RO forms. I don't know, when I used to do RO forms, we just didn't really bother. I don't know if people spend a bit more time on their RO forms these days. But when I look at them, sometimes they feel a little bit inaccurate.
Just timing differences, Dan. That's all. Yeah. Richard asked a question about council tax and about raising the point that if there are councils that are dealing with a cliff edge in 29-30, would they be allowed to increase their council tax, in the way that Westminster and Wandsworth were able to do in 26-27, or given the powers to do anyway. I think that must be part of the package that government starts to think about. I mean, and particularly, I was thinking about, but didn't really talk about today, EFS and what assumptions you might want to make about Band D. Clearly, you've got to make a pitch to government about what Band D increase you want to do. But lots of councils going into EFS are going for an increase above the threshold. Just talking to a few authorities about what that threshold is. It's not a threshold that's communicated very, very clearly, as far as I can tell. So you're kind of left in the dark a little bit to work out what the threshold might be. The idea is that you can't increase your Band D to more than the national average, but actually working out specifically what that national average is or ought to be is not that simple. And if you're on the cusp of it, if you're right on the threshold, that's quite an important thing. So I think that might be something I need to just drop into the model, and it'll be something that we will certainly talk about in the briefing note that I issue tomorrow about above threshold increases for EFS or for dealing with the cliff edge. It's a really good point, that, and I think increases in Band D could become a much more routine thing, especially then if you think that there are more people doing having to go in for EFS. It's not extraordinary anymore.
I think your graphs at the end of your presentation were really interesting, Adrian. They really showed, because you said that counties lift up, and you thought that was probably because of population and tax base, and I think it's Met's drift back down. It just shows, doesn't it, how much council tax dominates the system. And every year council tax goes up by 5%, but funding goes up by less. That the government needs to be even more focused around things like the recovery grant, just to make good the differentials in council tax. And it will get to a point where council tax becomes so dominant for some authorities. Whatever the government does for those that have low tax base, high A to C percentages, isn't going to catch up the Wokinghams and etc. So I think it's interesting. I'm not convinced Westminster or Wandsworth will take government up on their flexibility, but you're absolutely right. Others probably will and should. I think, is it Trafford in Manchester, really stranded on a low Band D, Hillingdon in Outer London stranded on a low Band D, and it's really, those authorities are struggling because of that. So, I used to work for districts mainly. The number of districts, we were arguing for years that £5 or 3% is a load of rubbish, because pretty much benefits no one now. So allowing some of those low Band D districts to catch up would just be logical, and it wouldn't. No one would really notice, if I'm honest, amidst the sort of much larger county increases.
And I think then you have got some boroughs as well, some councils as well, unitaries, boroughs, etc., who are, struggling, asking for EFS, but their council tax is already at the average or even a little bit above it. What do those councils do if increasing council tax above the threshold is not an option? Will ministers continue to be to sort of police that threshold very keenly, or will they be happy for it to get breached a little bit? I think that at some point in the near future that they will need to allow councils to go above that threshold, or above the average rather. Yeah, but who knows? The other thing that I think is with the equalisation is that when you do those sort of longer term time series, you start to realise that equalisation is not just a one-off thing that happens like it did in 26, 27, but actually is something that happens more frequently potentially, and it's that interaction between your own increases in council tax from tax-based growth, having a large tax base, Band D increases, and what the effect of equalisation that kind of like captures some of that or all of that every 3 years, and that's quite an interesting interaction as well. But I guess what you see there with the county's numbers is that equalisation doesn't fully take everything back from councils. Even though it's for whatever reason the interaction of it doesn't seem to be. It still allows counties and county unitaries to kind of catch up to the average. Maybe that's population, maybe it's other things as well.
I suppose if it is population, there would be more pressures on services that would go alongside that, wouldn't they?
Absolutely, yeah. Any other comments, any thoughts?
Anybody know when the LGR decisions are coming out, or if they are going to come out? Because Parliament rises in 2 weeks' time, isn't it? Or a week and a bit. What's the odds of anything coming out on that in the next week?
Steve Reid said he's pressing ahead.
He's pressing ahead.
Excellent. Yeah. Devon County came out yesterday. Have you saw that? Dan? Devon County Council saying it's too expensive. Got better things to spend our money on.
Yeah, like dumping loads of grit on the roads around where I cycle, and every April, not putting it in properly.
Yeah, I just don't know, Dan. I don't know. I mean, we're looking at a change in government, and Lindsay, we're assuming next week. Yeah, geez.
Oh,
it's going to drop that decision right before changing Prime Minister.
Lindsay, is that because Parliament rises the week after, or is it because you've had some specific intel that says it's next week?
Well, I think we were told that is Parliament rising next Thursday. That was next
Yes.
Thursday. Yeah, so we're just assuming that we were here before next Thursday, even if it's
Yeah.
Thursday morning.
Yeah.
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 You're Oxfordshire, Lindsay, aren't you?
Yes, we are.
So do you think Ridgeway will prevail? The Ridgeway unitary.
I really don't know. I just really don't know. I think because of the ones that, like the fast track ones that came out and the way they went, I just really don't know what
Yeah.
There's
what will
going
happen.
to be a greater Oxford, isn't there?
We're
There's
looking-
going to be.
Mm.
There's going to be.
Yeah. What about? And I think it's a greater Cherwell. That's what we're looking for, isn't it, Lynn?
Oh yeah, good and the great. We are.
Yeah. Who knows where that's going to go? I mean, it's to some degree, I think it'd be an extraordinary thing for what we assume would be an outgoing Secretary of State to make such a momentous decision for his successor. That's a huge decision, isn't it? Absolutely huge. Yeah. Yeah, I remember when I think it was back in 2010 when an outgoing Secretary of State decided to create new unitaries in Devon, Suffolk, and Norfolk with splits, non-district boundary splits, and that was a proper change. It was a proper change of government, but the incoming Secretary of State stopped those within a couple of weeks, I think. I don't know if it'll be in the same situation, but it just seems an extraordinary thing to do. But there we are. I think these things happen, don't they? Great stuff. Well, anything else? Anything else, Dan?
Nothing from me.
No. Great. Well, we'll get the recording out tomorrow morning. I'll get my full email out tomorrow afternoon with links to all the various the new model and the briefing note. And we're at the CIPFA conference next week if you want to drop in and see us if you're there. Otherwise, we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much for coming along. Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you.